Hello. Well, as I said I would, I'm going to today talk about sharecropping in a more detailed way since it was the main participant economic activity for African Americans in the post-Bellum South. And I'm also going to talk about some of the southern cities and the economic opportunities that were available before the Great Migration in southern cities. Okay. Well, immediately after the Civil War, the problem that white former plantation owners had now that they no longer had their slave labor force was how to keep up with the needs of agriculture when people were not going to be willing to be enslaved, when legally they could no longer be enslaved. And so the first thing that was tried was to pay wages for farm work. African Americans themselves wanted their own land, wanted to be in charge of their work time and their work activities and which members of their family were going to work. And so they were not super cooperative or happy with the wage labor system. The wage labor system in the immediate post-Civil War period included both the gang system, where individuals worked under an overseer who was appointed by the plantation owner, or the squad system, in which workers organized themselves under a leader, the squad leader. But this work was slow. People were being paid a very low wage. They were not super motivated to do it, as I said, because they really wanted to have their own land. And it was very difficult, even with the black codes, to keep the workforce immobilized in one place. And people had nothing tying them to a particular piece of property once the institution of slavery had been eliminated. And so the compromise that was hit on was the system of sharecropping. Sharecropping, along with restrictions on the workforce, immobilized the workforce by tying each particular sharecropping family to a piece of land. Sharecropping bound an entire family into a sharecropping contract. A monthly wage was provided when the entire family was bound under a sharecropping contract. But at the beginning of any particular planting year, the family that lived on and cultivated a piece of land had to furnish their own tools and seed and food and clothing. So they needed to take out almost a loan at the beginning of the planting year in order to be part of a sharecropping contract. And these loans were given out at 25% interest. So it's almost like you went to a payday loan place and took out all the money that you needed for the coming year. Obviously a very disadvantageous situation, financially speaking. This particular slide here shows some of the similarities and differences between sharecropping and slavery. It shows in number 1, the sharecropper is provided land and seed. In exchange, he promises the landowner half of the crop. The sharecropper buys food and clothing on credit, plants and harvests the crop, gives the landowner the crop to sell. So the sharecropper, as you can see from this diagram, does not have any control over what price will be paid for the crop or what price will be paid for the clothing and food and seeds and tools. The sharecropper gets half of the earnings, and then when settling up, the sharecropper is at the mercy of the landowner in terms of being told how much the crop is worth and how much is owed. Remember, as I said the other day, 90% of freed African Americans were illiterate after slavery was abolished, and of course this also meant innumeracy, the inability to compute the interest and how much was owed and how much ought to be paid. And so, as you can see in the last number there, number 6, to pay the debts, sharecroppers had to provide landowners with an agreement to give an even larger fraction of the crop the following year. Now, all of this could have been eliminated had the sharecropper had access to his own land, because as you can see here, the sharecropper is really paying the landowner for just the pleasure of planting on that particular piece of land that the landowner happens to own. The landowner himself doesn't have to put in any effort whatsoever. What's different between sharecropping and slavery is the sharecropping family can designate when members of the family are going to work, whether women get to stay inside the home and do housework and cooking and that sort of thing, whether any of the children can be spared to go to school. And of course, the landowner doesn't have legal say over the actual bodies of the sharecropper's family. But other than that, in terms of the inability over time to move off of the plantation, sharecropping and slavery shared many aspects. Another form of labor that was used extensively in the post-Civil War period, again, all towards solving the problem by the landowners of not having a fixed labor force, was convict labor. People who had been arrested, often for petty offenses, were then compelled to work, because the 13th Amendment, as you may or may not know, does not prevent involuntary servitude as long as the person who is doing the unpaid labor is a convict. So people would be arrested for petty offenses, and then they would be made to stay in jail and work off their fines. Convicts were used in all kinds of different endeavors, especially farm work. Some of the prisons in the South were actually farms, railroad construction, mining. And as you can see from my PowerPoint slide here, 1/4 of Mississippi state convicts were children. So one way to trap children into having to work as opposed to going to school was convicting them of petty offenses and then forcing them to be laboring convicts. A couple more things to say about sharecropping. As I said already, the landlord was entitled to a share of the crop, usually half, but that fraction could grow as people became successively indebted. We call the system of growing more and more in debt through this process debt peonage. So a peon is kind of an involuntary laborer, and this is somebody whose debt has caused them to have to work for somebody without any choice. It was also really difficult for people, once they got behind in their debt, to just kind of move in the middle of the night, take up their families, and try to get a sharecropping situation somewhere else, because there were riders, kind of institution not unlike the Klan, who would go around through the rural countryside stopping people and finding out if they had decamped from sharecropping situations without permission. There were also laws that existed in the late 19th century called enticement laws throughout the South. And these laws made it impossible for employers to hire people away who were already under sharecropping or tenancy contracts. And this reduced mobility even further. But again, you really don't have a free market in labor in the South after the Civil War. Everything was impinging on African Americans' ability to command the wage that they should have been able to get. Another activity that was carried out in rural areas that I don't have on the slide here was domestic servitude. So to the extent that black women in the South were not working in the fields, they were often making money for their families, working as domestic servants in white people's houses. Their employers could impose all kinds of humiliating restrictions and rules. But just as people carved out a sphere of autonomy for themselves during the time of slavery, there were ways that domestic servants were able to assert themselves. They would sabotage their work, use their mobility as much as possible, live up to their employer's low job expectations. Well, fine, if you think I'm lazy, then I'm going to work slowly. And there were also unspoken traditions like the servant's pan, in which cooks working in white households were expected to take home extra food or just take whatever they needed for their families. Okay, so opportunities very, very limited in the South. Now, one of the ways in which African Americans in the post-Civil War period attempted to increase their economic opportunity was to migrate from the rural South to southern cities. The development and growth of industry in the South, coupled with the need for workers to help cities grow, naturally attracted African Americans to places like Richmond, Virginia, Nashville, Tennessee, Atlanta, Georgia, and Washington, D.C. And the good thing about these kinds of places is there were more intellectual and social activities for people to engage in after their work hours. There were also more opportunities for people to set up African American businesses. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a very important black intellectual in the late 19th century and early 20th century, noted that people, to the extent that they could, attempted to patronize within the black community of business people. He wrote, quote, "In every city in the United States which has considerable Negro population, the colored group is serving itself in religion, medical care, legal advice, and often educating its children. In growing degree, also, it is serving itself in insurance, houses, books, and amusements." So people worked within the black community to grow those businesses. And a good example of this is Richmond, Virginia's Jackson Ward. It was nicknamed the Black Wall Street of America in the late 19th century, and its businesses included insurance companies, banks, drugstores, newspapers, physicians, dentists, barbershops, butchers, candy stores, an ice cream manufacturer, building contractors, photographers, tailors, a grocery, a jeweler, and others. So you can see here the variety of occupations that African Americans undertook, and really the opportunity for the growth of a black middle class. In 1883, in Richmond, Virginia, John Mitchell Jr. founded a weekly paper called the Richmond Planet, and this was one of many urban African American newspapers in the 19th century. And it featured stories on topics of black interests, such as lynchings and other violence against African Americans, which I'll talk more about in another lecture, and ways in which people were challenging their exclusion from political participation. Now, also in Virginia, in Richmond, there were 4 black banks. One of Richmond's banks was founded in 1903 by Maggie Lena Walker. She was the first black woman bank president in the nation. Walker, who you can see pictured here, was the daughter of former slaves. She was a teacher. She was a member of the National Association of Colored Women, and she was a good friend of the famous black educator Mary McLeod Bethune, who was the founder of the Daytona Normal and Industrial Institute for Negro Girls in Florida. Jackson Ward was also home to 31 churches in 1907, 23 of which were Baptist. Richmond's black churches served the needs of the poor. They also set up voluntary associations like the Richmond Neighborhood Association and the Richmond Welfare League. So there were black churches in black communities. There were also land-grant colleges. And as I said the other day, most of these colleges were intended to educate teachers. The Richmond Colored Normal School was financed by the Freedmen's Bureau before it became part of the city school system in 1876. Virginia Normal and Collegiate Institute, founded in 1882, was funded by the state of Virginia until it was designated as a land-grant college act, or a land-grant college, under the Land-Grant College Act of 1890. Now, this 1890 act required states to either open their land-grant colleges to people of all racial backgrounds or to establish separate black colleges. And it will not come as a surprise to you that most of these southern states, pretty much all of the southern states, decided to open separate colleges for African American students. Despite the fact that Richmond, Virginia, which we're using as an example here, had a prosperous black community, white people felt that the new public transportation that existed in Richmond ought to be segregated on the basis of race. Now, middle-class black people felt as though there should be distinctions in streetcars, but by class rather than race. So they thought that poor people of any race should sit in cars that were less nice than wealthy people of any race, and they really emphasized their own respectability and that of the middle-class black community. But in 1904, a Virginia law gave conductors the right to tell people where to sit, and the conductors banished black people from the streetcars unless they happened to be taking care of somebody who was white. So if you were a maid or a nanny taking care of an infirm white person or a young white child, that was fine. Then you could sit in the white streetcars. If you were a wealthy, bank president like Maggie Lena Walker, then you had to sit in the much less nice separate black cars at the end of the streetcar. And these streetcars usually were much dirtier because they were the smoking car for people of any race who wanted to smoke cigarettes. It's where a lot of the baggage on streetcars would travel in case things were being brought from one end of town to another. The way that the community dealt with the segregation of the cars was just not to ride the cars. They didn't have vocal protests. They didn't march on City Hall. Leaders like John Mitchell Jr., who was the editor of the Planet newspaper, said he thought part of the reason for the segregation law was to try to rile up the African American community, to elicit violence, elicit irrational behavior from the community because they were angry, and then say, "Oh, I told you so. This is why we didn't want you to ride in the cars." So this fight against segregation in the way of a quiet boycott continued. African American working classes were integral to the boycott. Black people who drove carts gave others free rides downtown. Black laundresses and cooks walked with heavy burdens, miles across town. And ultimately, the owner of the streetcar lines, a company called Virginia Passenger and Power, went into receivership. They had to declare a certain kind of bankruptcy, but they didn't go out of business completely. In other cities that were not Richmond, there were much more vocal boycotts against streetcar segregation, but I will be talking more about this kind of issue in Lecture 4, which is a lecture about Jim Crow. Finally, in southern black urban communities in the late 19th century, there were some efforts at interracial unionism. There was an organization in the late 19th century called the Knights of Labor, which had locals across the country, hundreds of local unions throughout North and South, And the Knights of Labor didn't discriminate on the basis of race. They unionized black and white people, men and women, skilled and unskilled labor. So there was some gesturing in the direction of interracial unionism in the pre-1900 period. But the Knights of Labor really only lasted from the late 1870s to about 1886. So that was a pretty short-lived movement. Finally, here we have an Emancipation Day parade showing the African American community in a southern urban area celebrating one of the holidays that was specially celebrated by the black community. All right, so this gives you some idea of the way in which people were getting along economically, what they had to do on a daily basis. And in the next lecture, lecture 4, we're going to be looking at the many, many legal and political obstacles that were put in the way of the black community to prevent them from living happy and peaceful lives in the South, the Jim Crow laws. So see you soon.